Bandwidth provided by Recursive Squirrel Interactive. Transcription services provided by transcribeme.com. Episode 533, Finding Our Strategy. Monday, February 25th, 2019. It's time for this week's edition of the BeanCast, a weekly discussion about the news and issues facing marketers today. I'm your host, Bob Norton. Thanks for joining us. The ad world has a terrible reputation in terms of workplace bullying, but is it worse than in other professions? And no matter the answer, what are the root causes and how do we raise the professionalism within the industry? Tonight we'll discuss. Also, where we should look for strategic guidance, whether programmatic masking of data is really possible, why crowdfunding is back, plus this week's Ad Fail 5. That's the lineup. Let's meet tonight's panel. Thanks for joining us for this week's BeanCast. I'm Bob Norp, and with me on the panel for this evening, we start with former Adobe executive and now founder of data consulting firm Quantant Marketing, Miss Tamara Gaffney. Tamara, how are you?
Hey, it's great to be back on.
Great to have you on. And also with us, he's the founder and admiral of consulting firm the HMS Beagle, author, speaker, Mr. Joseph Jaffe. Hi, Joe.
Ahoy there, matey.
Glad to have you both on the program. I think that every once in a while I get lucky and I get a panel that's uniquely qualified to talk about some of the topics that we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm really grateful to have you on this week. And first up, this one was a Digiday article that shined a light on an all too common thing in the ad world, which is workplace bullying, both by bosses and by clients, and probably by coworkers as well. So I thought it'd be a good idea to spend a few minutes at the top of the show discussing the issue and maybe shed some more light on the subject. So Tamara, the obvious first question is advertising and marketing as a profession truly worse than other professions in regard to bullying? You read this article and it sounds like the problem is unique to us, but is it really?
I've never been in any other industry other than advertising and marketing, so I can't speak to what it's like anywhere else. I can say that there is a certain amount of personalities, shall we say, that are drawn to this particular area. In particular, when I was at ad agencies, I recall the head of the ad agency one day becoming very upset over something. I don't know what. We were in an open office space. It was very hip in downtown San Francisco. And he picked up a potted plant and threw it across the room. And the entire office was dead quiet. So there is definitely a bit of that aggressive, assertive, charge the hill kind of personality in advertising. And that sometimes flows into marketing, but I'm a little surprised that it flows into email marketing because that's not a normal place.
Yeah, I think all of us can point back to some moment in our past where we experienced directly the rage of a coworker or the rage of a client or the rage of a boss. And it seems like, for me at least, it seemed to be a problem with the fact that we were in a creative profession. I mean, it always comes down to when you're in this loose world of dealing with creative ideas and artwork and other types of things, you end up with a certain lack of professionalism that is just not present in a lot of other professions. I mean, now that's not to say that you don't see a lot of this kind of behavior, Joe, when you're looking at other professions. I mean, you look at the financial world and you see guys having tantrums all the time. But it seems to me that with the agency world in particular, and we're talking about the creative agency world, there's a certain lack of professionalism that seems to be unique to our industry.
Look, again, I can't comment on other industries, but I can tell you that first of all, you got to take a step back and look at the advertising profession as being one of the most disrespected and poorest perceived industries. Second to um, used car salesmen, politicians and lawyers.
And
So
IRS agents, don't forget about them. They're
right.
fun.
So I mean, we're like, we're pond scum, right? We're at the bottom of the barrel, and I think the reality is that there is a domino effect, which is ultimately, if you're treated badly, you typically are going to take that out on somebody else. It's just the way it is. It's one of the first, when I started my career in the fast food in the QSR industry. What I always would do when I was training a lot of the frontline staff was to tell them, and also the managers of these restaurants, of these quick service restaurants, which is, at the end of the day, the person at the cash register, they are the brand. They're the brand. So all the marketing and advertising and everything under the sun, at the end of the day, if they've had a bad day, if they've broken up with their boyfriend or girlfriend, and they sneer or rude to a customer, that becomes the entire experience of what that brand means to the customer. And it's hard when you're talking, to or about minimum wage for the most part, employees. And so I think what it comes down.
I have to stop though for a second, because I actually saw creatives in particular get treated as if they could do no wrong, and they were very permitted to have bad professionalism, and it was kind of like a spoiled child. So some of that maybe is this low paid worker situation, and that was me because I was a media person and they get paid like crap. But the creatives, they were permitted to be nasty and bad, don't you think?
I do, and I think that again, that comes. So you're bringing up another very very interesting and very relevant topic, which is that you know the great ideas can come from everyone, except that it has to be the creative department. And so yes, you've definitely had that kind of. I don't know if that I would call it bullying. And Bob, it's interesting because maybe that's what it always was. But creatives always were self-entitled, and media people and suits were always kind of treated really poorly. And I guess times are changing because, with the unbundling of media, which now has been going on for 2 decades, media people are the ones calling the shots now. They're the ones that are tied to the Facebooks and the Googles and some of these bigger contracts, and they're the ones with all the perks. So maybe the bullying, maybe the pendulum has swung.
What do you think the underlying causes are, though, behind this kind of unprofessional attitude that permeates so much of the advertising world, especially the agency world? It seems to me that for me, it has always come down to the fact that it's a creative profession. I mean, I talk to Whitney all the time about this, and she has a creative profession. She's a costume designer. She works with theatrical productions, and there's a certain amount of unprofessionalism that goes with the creative juices that are always in play. People are so about protecting their art and their vision at the expense of the fact that this is a job and you have to do your job and you have to be responsible and you have to be accountable to the people around you and you have to present a good face on any situation. You can't let stress drive you to some kind of outrage or outburst or some kind of like meltdown in the workplace. Yet it seems like we almost foster that, exactly like you say, Tamara. It seems like we almost foster that in the ad world. Am I missing something? Is there some reason for this? I mean, it's just like, is it just the fact that we're giving wide berth to creative, or we're giving wide berth to the creative genius who's in charge of the business or whoever's at the top of the heap, and we're just not willing to call people out for bad behavior? Tamara, are you still there?
I think that the advertising agencies themselves have been a bit of a laggard in creating experiences, right? So they're stuck in Mad Men kind of ways of thinking still, maybe a little bit more advanced, but not much more advanced than Mad Men days. And what's interesting to me is think about the future. In the future, we're headed for what most people see as the creative economy, where a lot of our chores are automated and we have AI support. And so we're unlocked and unleashed to be much more creative in every job. So if every creative person becomes a spoiled brat or bully or whatever, then oh my gosh, what's going to happen to the workforce? I think what's going to actually happen is that all of that bad behavior will ultimately become intolerable and those people will be filtered out.
I don't want to pile on the creative profession though, because having been a creative, having come up through that particular line of work in the business to where I am today, there are people who are really professional about doing their job. It's just that we glorify the people who aren't. I mean, it's something about the industry that I don't think they do get pushed out. The people who make the most noise and are the wackiest, craziest, most temperamental, those are the ones that we say, well, that's really creative juices there. That's something going on. This is a dynamic personality. We'll excuse this because they're coming up with great ideas, and the great ideas are the most important thing, at the expense of just decency and common courtesy when we're actually working within a creative environment. I don't think that the problem is all across the board with creative as much as it is. I think that there's something wrong with the management style within agencies that allows for this kind of behavior to happen.
And I'm glad you said that, because I want to take the conversation away from just the creative part for a second. I think that when it comes to this industry, it really can be explained from a very binary standpoint. You've got buyers and sellers, and the sellers run after the buyers, and the buyers treat the sellers like crap. And that's what's really happening. And the underbelly of that dynamic is the fact that there is a tremendous amount of insecurity and paranoia and bravado. And you've got a lot of these buyers that are scared, and they are threatened, and they are unbelievably spineless and insecure. And so they take it out on the sellers. And and it's a real problem it's a real problem in our industry. The lack of professionalism and respect and integrity is killing our business.
What's driving that insecurity though? What's driving that insecurity? Is it just the fact that your job, there's no job security that makes you insecure, or people just don't know how to do their jobs and they're trying to hide that fact?
I'll give you a few. I mean, one of them comes down to how well people are paid. One of them comes down to fear of technology, and so kind of doubling down on the kind of Super Bowl lifestyle or mentality, instead of being able to be open-minded to experiment and embrace new technology. And so instead of trying to have those conversations and create that transparency, what you end up is a much more closed guard and kind of insider type of response. But I think the point that I wanted to make, again, just getting a buyer, a client, to return a call, to have the common decency to respond to a seller or a publisher trying to get some time with them, to give them a straight answer, to manage the expectations. The fact is, there is a complete lopsided approach in our business, and I think anyone who's been a seller would probably be nodding their heads vociferously with what I'm saying, right? Which is, when dealing with, first of all, the agencies, but then the agencies themselves are sellers to the clients, and it's it really is a bit of a vicious cycle.
Well, and I think that in addition to all of that, there is probably got to be a lot of fear that the entire advertising concept is not going so well. We are at the point where we're pivoting. I believe it's in 2019 is what I've read, pivoting from traditional advertising to digital advertising as more than 50% of ad spend. It's finally reaching over that 50% mark. And digital advertising is not going so well. And part of the reason is because they're not able to really provide a lot of value. Banner ads are not super great. The ad blocking situation is getting worse and worse. Now we have, did you read about the browser? The Safari browser is going to, basically time cookies out and not accept cookies. And so there's a lot of challenge in the digital advertising space, and it's especially difficult for the ad agency people because a lot of clients have taken that part in-house. And the traditional side is going to be less and less. The Super Bowl didn't do as well as it normally does. And so the whole industry, I believe, is in a massive transition. It's almost like retail Mageddon, only with advertising.
And that brings up the question, right, that I brought up earlier. Does it mean that everybody in the business just doesn't know what they're doing, or is like reaching around with and trying to figure out what do we do next? Because this thing that we've trusted for all these years is not working as effectively as it once did. Is there any fix for any of this? I mean, it's just like, is technology the answer? Is automation the answer? I mean, what do you think, Tamara?
Well, I personally don't think there is a fix, and I know that that's going to be a bit of a controversial opinion. I believe that advertising as we know it is coming to an end, and that we're going to need to find different ways to make people aware. One of the big things that I asked a Gen Z, or these younger folks, they're up to about 22 years old right now. I asked them, if you had a sport like soccer that you were really into and you wanted to know about new things going on that you could buy for soccer, wouldn't you want to see an ad on that? And the answer from every one of these Gen Zs was no. We would rather hear about it from our friends and from our networks. And I thought, oh crap, this is not going to go very well for advertising because younger folks just block it. They don't want it. They tune it out. And so the advertising world has to evolve in the way that information is given and wanted to be received. In addition to that, add all of the privacy situation, and it just creates a big mess for advertising that I don't think they will ever be able to do the same as they've always done, which is, take $1 million and put it into media buys. That just doesn't seem like it's going to be in the future.
One thing about that, I mean, it's just, I know this is off topic and we're actually straying into the next topic, which we probably should move on to. But, the fact is 22-year-olds have never really paid attention to advertisements. I mean, it's just like advertising is just not effective at reaching that particular demo as much as it's able to reach the 35-year-old or 40-year-old who sits in front of the TV or is streaming stuff and is more willing and able to deal with an advertisement, wouldn't you say? I mean, it's just like...
I don't think so, because I used to do advertising for Mattel in the 90s. And that was obviously younger, but advertising worked at that point. And I also know that things like Brides Magazine and PC Magazine and a lot of the very specific travel magazines, things like that, were more than 50% advertising, and people would pay $3 for them. And that was a younger target. And so I believe, Vogue used to be more than 50% ads and people would pay for it. I don't believe that they will pay for that anymore. They will not, even if it's targeted for them and of interest to them, they don't seem to want to learn about things from advertising.
Well, I have to say, I don't know how we got on that tangent, but that's a hell of a tangent, and I appreciate a tangent better than most people.
I know that you do.
My own ADD. But I did want to come back to, one of the source articles spoke about how a client was talking to an agency person and how they were almost verbally abusing them, and the question is whether the agency would have put the phone down or pushed back. I think again what it comes down to. And I'll bring it back to the tangent to try and kind of connect the dots, is when you're in an industry that's going through so much change and so much pain and so much disruption, you shouldn't check your manners at the door. And that's what's happened. And so, common decency and professionalism isn't an optional extra. It should be a mandatory, and we could almost argue that if we double down now and actually err back in the side of being professional and treat each other the way, like as human beings, it's actually going to help us recognize, guess what? It's not just buyers versus sellers, but we're all in this together.
I think part of this problem with this is the service industries are always the worst, bear the brunt of any kind of bad behavior. I mean, even if you have a perfectly well-run retail operation, your customer who's coming in the door doesn't necessarily have that same level of professionalism and is going to berate the store manager or berate the cashier for something that the cashier has no power over. I mean, and that's at the heart of what the problem is with advertising. It's a service industry. And as a service industry, we bear the brunt of bad behavior from clients. So, I don't think that there's any fix for that. I mean, service industries always bear the brunt of client bad behavior, but they don't have to necessarily be a breeding ground of in-house bad behavior. And I think that's the real problem that needs to be addressed in the industry. Well, we started to move on to this next topic, so I'm just going to go into it right now. We all struggle with strategy, both in confusing it with tactics and in where we uncover the insights that guide it. But a few articles this week offered up some really good points about where the best strategies come from. So, Joe, first article, the Sloan Review from the Sloan School of Business suggests that the best insights and strategies come from within your own company. So, how overlooked are employees in developing business strategies, and how do we make a culture that looks to the common insight that we have, the conventional wisdom that we have waiting dormant within our organization, and capitalize on it and actually act on it?
Well, I got to tell you, I mean, talk about, you said at the top of the show that these topics were perfectly suited to your panelists. So thank you for this topic. And I don't know if it's inappropriate for my shameless plug right now, but I got to tell you that this is exactly what I've written about in my new book. I mean it. I mean, it's incredible, and I believe in this topic so much that the number one most underutilized asset and resource for corporations that are struggling today would be their employees. And I dedicate at least a chapter on talking about this idea and how to turn employees into entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs, and why it's so important to create Kickstarters and Shark Tanks and those kinds of products or idea engines, even investment engines inside a corporation. One of the things that this comes back to, I probably said this 20 years ago, which is, who knows your brand better? Your agency, your C-suite, or your customers and your employees. And it's rhetorical because it's obvious that customers and employees are the people that live this brand and are this brand at the consumption, at the rock face, at the transactional level. So this point, you asked, is it true? Hell yeah, it's true. It is so important now more than ever, especially, going back to the first topic, the changing role of creativity, or the failing of advertising. Where are breakthrough ideas and transformative ideas going to come from? It's not going to come, sorry to say, from the agency. It's not going to come from overpaid executives. It's going to come from people that are, not just living the brand, are the brand.
Wow. I have to say, having just come from a large corporation, I feel like putting people in structures and boxes and then telling them to sit down and, do what they're told is so prevalent that, for me, the only way to really become innovative and entrepreneurial is to literally get out of a big company and go build something. And then the big company will absorb you, and then you will leave again and go build something, because inside these big companies that I'm observing, there's just not any movement towards changing how structures work and how hierarchies work inside, that cause people not to be able to bring forth the innovative ideas and entrepreneurship internally.
And by the way, Tamara, that's the best case scenario, because one of the source articles that we read talks about John Lasseter, who worked at the Walt Disney Company, really pushed them to get into new forms of computer animation. This is in the 80s. He was actually fired. he goes and joins Lucasfilm's computer graphics group, the company that later becomes Pixar. And then Walt Disney ends up purchasing Pixar for $7.4 billion. And today, Lasseter is Chief Creative Officer of Walt Disney and Pixar Animation Studios. So this is, when I say the best case scenario, this is Walt Disney gladly overpaying and then some for a sure thing, and almost probably being okay to pay that premium. Most companies don't get that luxury. In fact, most companies get taken down by either that disgruntled or overlooked or underappreciated employee.
But in that example, I mean, it showcases that even though they had to buy the company that was their savior in terms of the animation studio, Walt Disney has become a much different place because of Lasseter's leadership and because of the Pixar influence on the animation group. The way that they approach projects has completely changed, and they are an organization now that listens to strategic ideas coming from within the employee ranks, just like Pixar has always been like that. So it's, I'm sure people who work there probably have a much different attitude about it and probably have lots of complaints about how corporate and how much of a labyrinth of red tape the whole place is. But what it comes down to is they did make a shift and they did make a change. So isn't any organization, as long as they're willing to listen to their employees and take advice and take insights from within the organization, able to make these types of changes and be able to be more responsive to the marketplace?
Yeah, come on, Bob. I mean, that's like asking this year or next year, will companies finally figure out how to use the Super Bowl effectively, and do something good with $5 million investment in a 30-second spot? The fact is, again, companies are run by insecure, threatened. They are so hierarchical and patriarchal. They're so top down. And there is so much hubris in these companies, that pretty much the only time they'll recognize, it's like the boiling frog syndrome, which is they're not even aware of what's happening and how the company is ultimately dying as they perpetuate the status quo. So in this case, yeah, it did take $7 billion. This was a $7 billion learning curve. Most companies don't get that luxury, and it comes, again, look at the first topic, right? You've got these siloed, dysfunctional corporations that are unable to collaborate, that are unable to communicate, that are unable to treat each other decently, and in the agency world, it's the creatives bullying the media people, or the clients bullying the agencies. And for the most part, in corporations, you've got executives bullying employees.
Right. I mean, in the tech industry, it's the engineers bullying everybody else. It's just like, yeah, I understand that. There's that ongoing bad behavior that comes out of being in a large corporation, and you're not listening to the employees, you're not valuing the employee contribution. And that leads to my next question, which was going to be, what role do you see the consultant playing in all of this if you're supposed to be looking at your employees for strategic insight? But it seems to me like the consultant will always be a well-paid person in this mix, because companies aren't able to actually look at themselves. They're not able to plow and plumb these depths. They're not able to find out what kind of insights and capital they have. They need outside resources to come in and tell them what to do. I mean, Tamara, is that a fair estimation that consultancy is going to be completely safe going forward? Whether
Well, I hope so, considering that's what I just decided to do. But let me take one step back just very briefly, and go back to the fact that everybody has a boss. And even if you're the president of a huge corporation, you have the board, and the board has the financial world. And because everyone is getting, at the top anyways, so much of their compensation and personal wealth out of the stock market, they don't want to upset anything and do anything really radical. And so I believe that, and this, kind of going back to consultants and also going back to all the different kinds of ways of bringing innovation in through buying it, which would be buying a company and acquiring it, or buying a consultant and having them come in and help. I think that all of that has got to be a part of the mix, and I think it's a good thing, because companies themselves have so much inertia to continue to do what they're doing. They have to go and let the experiments happen in a way that the stock market and those who are the quote unquote bosses of that business can ignore until it becomes something that they can handle, or they start to see the vision. And then, and consultants can do this in a way where it's very subtle. We can come in and we can help with the program, and nobody really has to change anything about how they're doing their own performance measurement. But they can try something with a consultant, or they can have a consultant come in and say something that they can't say because it's politically difficult for them to say it.
And for me, that's the key factor. I mean, the ability to circumvent politics and bring in an outside voice who's not beholden to saying the right thing and doing the right thing all the time in order to maintain political clout, to maintain your position within a company. That outside resource, that outside insight is so important, whether or not you are listening to your company or not. I mean, even if you're an organization that spends a lot of time listening to employees and taking advice and taking it seriously and acting on these strategies that you're sourcing, you still need outside insight and outside resource. Which brings me to the other article that caught my eye, from this one from McKinsey, suggesting that the best strategies always look for and capitalize on the changes in business rather than the ongoing trends. Look for the changes in the marketplace, things that are going to affect the business down the line, as opposed to how to act on what's currently hot. Joe, what do you think about that statement? Agree, disagree, thoughts?
Well, one of the things that I I also spent quite a bit of time talking about in Built to Suck is this idea that we need long-term thinking, but we don't need long-term planning anymore, because the world continues to change and change in the most disruptive and transformative fashion. And certainly we all live. I'm preaching to the choir right now. So in this particular case, the idea of what is strategy, and part of what this article also talks about is that strategy should be separated from budgets and budget setting and budget planning, because that really, number one, gets into tactics, and number two, it has a time-based
so you're suggesting that the strategy portion of the operation should happen prior to the creation of budgets, not after the creation of budgets.
Well, the article actually says it should be happening on a parallel path, and I agree with that. And I think the thing is, the question you asked about changes in the market and marketplace, those are, especially if you can spot them early, and you can accurately and smartly put a number, an order of magnitude, and a time frame on it. These are about big bets, and on one of the source articles talks about Apple, and specifically the bet that was placed on the iPod. I firmly believe it was the iPod that saved Apple, nothing else. That became the catalyst and the tipping point for growth. And on the flip side, when you look at Sears, this was a company that grew based on two massive business and marketplace changes, which was the deurbanization of America, and also the incredible rise of people buying cars and driving out to these massive malls that were out in the burbs and away from these metropolitan areas. Sears did the opposite. They didn't capitalize on one of the biggest trends that has fundamentally changed there and every other bricks and mortar retail, and of course that would be e-commerce. So absolutely, first mover advantage counts, but from a strategic standpoint, that absolutely becomes part of survival, right? It becomes part of a mission critical approach to not only surviving but thriving, competitive advantage, differentiation, and those are not tactics, and those are not budgets, and those don't really have a time frame, when ultimately they are part of the prime directive, right? Which is which is, being able to sustain growth and be a profitable entity.
I think that following change is really dangerous. It's often easy to be expecting change to happen faster than it's going to. So, for example, if you're going to go and super big bet into self-driving cars, and you expect that to be something in 3 years that you're going to bet your business on, and it takes 10, you're going to be out of business. And I think change is very difficult to figure out when to hit the sweet spot. Look at the Apple Newton and the Palm Pilot. There's just so many examples, dead on the side of the road companies that tried to follow change as their main strategy. I believe that fast following a market leader is a lot simpler and less risky. That's not to say that you shouldn't be a market leader, but I don't think even Amazon you could point to as necessarily a market leader, and Google you couldn't either, because there were search engines. They just did it better. And so I would really worry about following change as the main way of building a strategy.
Well, also just to kind of expand on that as well, I think the difference is, right, when we talk about changes in business fundamentally versus ongoing trends, which is the way that Bob set it up. What we're not talking about, so if this is what you're alluding to, then I completely agree, which is IoT, which is VR, which is AI, which is focused on a technology, as opposed to something that is fundamental to the business model.
Right, we're talking about IBM realizing that typewriters aren't the future anymore, and that we need to really invest in computers, and that computers are no longer the future anymore, and now we need to get involved with business consulting. And
well, look, and I mean, look at Blockbuster versus Netflix. I mean, so where I would disagree with you, Tamara, is the fact that what we're witnessing now more than ever is the inability. You talk about, look, if you can perfect being a fast follower and be really damn good at it, then that's awesome. Most companies, the time that, what do they say? There are 3 types of people, right? Those who make things happen, those who watch things happen, and those who turn around and say, what happened? And when you look at Netflix versus Blockbuster, my fear is that if you're wrong, or if you're too slow in this particular case, you are dead. You are dead on arrival. And so, that's why I would say that it's important, especially when talking about strategy. Number one, divorce it from a budget, divorce it from tactics, but also make sure that it is fundamental to the business model and the revenue streams of that company, as opposed to something that, in fact, could be putting too many eggs in the wrong basket, which is what you were talking about.
And I've seen strategy, and I know we all have examples of this. People call it strategy. It's not strategy. People don't know what strategy really means. They overuse the term. Everyone thinks they're strategic.
Oh, I know this. I teach creative strategy at NYU, and my students, this is the hardest thing to communicate to them, and it's the hardest thing for them to grasp is, what the hell is strategy? I mean, that it's such a loose concept when we talk about it. It's more about how to create a sandbox, not how to build the sandcastle. I try to talk in metaphors, but people still struggle to understand the difference between the doing and the why.
Yeah. So I believe that's part of the problem, is that people don't really know what they're talking about when they say strategy, and nor do they know what their strategy really is. And I've seen, it's interesting that they're talking about budget driving strategy. What I've seen happen more than budget driving strategy is that somebody's speech at some big event drives strategy. And they sit down and decide, what am I going to say at this big event? And how is that going to set the tone for our entire year? And I'm thinking, you've got to be kidding me. This is how you set strategy, is by what you want to get up and say at a conference. And so I think that we have to click up quite a few levels to think about what is wrong with corporate strategy today, and why is it not really strategic thinking going on.
Well, what kind of fixes would you recommend? I mean, it's obviously not waiting till the big conference to come up with your strategy, quote unquote, but actually doing research, actually playing with the data, actually coming up with insights, connections, nodes. I mean, it's just like, what do we need to be doing more of within the corporate environment so that we get to more productive strategies in the end?
I think one of the things that we don't do enough of in corporate America or corporate any country is test and learn, test and learn. I saw a really interesting presentation from, and I can't remember his name right now, but he was one of the creators of the Google Labs. And he was talking about how when they were doing the Google Glass, that instead of going and trying to decide whether or not the typeface should be red or white or whatever, he did a quick prototype. And that he prototyped and prototyped and prototyped until he could figure out what the best approaches were. And I know this isn't strategy, but I believe that with strategy too, the chances are that you want to really look at a couple of different things and test the waters in some way, whether it be with talking to customers, whether it be with getting some data or some research, or maybe you just go ahead and start a few different paths. I describe strategy as not the mountain I want to summit, but the route I want to take to get up the mountain. And it's okay to try 2 or 3 different routes to get up that mountain. But if you don't have enough manpower or water or whatever, you're not going to make it if you split your troops up too much. So you've got to make sure that you're going to get all the way up to the top of that mountain. And if you can do 2, maybe 3 different approaches, why not try that instead of trying to make a big bet? I heard the term big bet so many times, and I kept thinking to myself, that's kind of crazy. Do you really want to just do everything like you're going to take all your chips on the roulette table and put it on 32 black? I don't think so. I think we should test.
I would just add that, while the test and learn is nothing more than a tactic, you can in fact have a strategy that encompasses this idea of ongoing rapid prototyping and testing and learning that really kind of is part of a commitment to innovation, specifically if the company or the brand occupies that kind of position in terms of being on the forefront of change and being open to and leaning in to taking chances and taking risks, particularly with a younger audience. The other thing is going back to what Tamara was saying about this idea of placing bets and sometimes being too early or too late and spending and putting too much, what did you call it, putting it all on red on 32 or whatever the case may be. I think it comes down to the fact that companies don't know how to manage time. And that's the problem. The problem is they move too slowly in general. And so the 5-year plan, I mean, nobody talks about the 5-year plan anymore. But what companies are doing specifically and specifically with marketing is this whole idea of sitting down in the 3rd quarter and planning the next year. It's like I often say, quite frankly, if Trump and Kim Jong-un have a fight, we may very well see, ourselves getting, God forbid, nuked, or something like that. And the fact is, we don't know what the hell's going to happen tomorrow, and yet we're so damn sure that we can forecast with accuracy what's going to happen over the next 12 to 15 months. So the problem is that we can't implement and execute quickly with these test and learns. It's a double whammy, and this whole idea of long-term planning. That's why I said we need to abandon long-term planning. But instead, what we've got to replace it with is long-term thinking, bigger thinking about being able to be smarter and shrewder about placing those bets, whether we call them big bets or small bets. The fact is, if we're wrong, we're dead.
Ongoing strategy, a corporate culture of strategic thinking. I think that's a really great place to leave this. I wish we could continue this conversation, but speaking of timing and management of time, we're almost out of it, so we've got 2 more subjects to cover real quickly. First up, a new GDPR complaint alleges that Google, along with the IAB UK, have basically been deceiving consumers regarding whether collected data was or even could be masked by programmatic platforms. So, Tamara, how significant is this case and how does it impact the business? Do you believe that programmatic really can adequately mask an individual's personal information adequately enough to make it so that real-time bidding solutions can work in the EU under GDPR?
Wow, that is a really tough to answer question, especially because nobody really knows how all that stuff works. It's a bit of a black box. And I think that's what the crux of this article is what is going on here and how do you make sure? And I guess it's a good thing that outside parties are asking these questions and going through discovery. I think that, going back to whether or not programmatic advertising is even really going to be here in the future, I think it will ultimately play out as not necessarily the best way to influence people to buy your product. But having said that, for now, we have advertising, we have programmatic. And I think that there's a lot of drama being brought up around data. And I think that most of the people, and having had access to trillions of transactions worth of data in the past, in the work that I used to do, I could kind of sometimes see in a URL string somebody's a little bit of personal information because the URL string itself carried that. And by URL string, what I mean is if you look at the address bar, sometimes the way that a website creates its page has a question mark with all kinds of information in it. You can see it as a consumer. And that information sometimes gets into a database of some sort and it gets picked apart. And that might be a way where personal information is not safe. And that has to do more with how websites are designed and not so much about, data collection. But there's just so many questions about it. And really what's happening is that people don't believe that their data is private, and that's a problem.
One of the things that was most interesting to me was there was one analyst in the article that I was sharing who talked about the fact that the fix is simple. It's easy. The industry's known about this all this time. They're just not doing it. How fair of a comment is that? That, just turning off these certain areas of data collection will, adequately anonymize the data so that you can continue doing real-time bidding solution. Yeah, it's not as powerful or as targeted as maybe you like, or maybe it's a little bit more work for you in terms of data cleansing, but it's possible. And how accurate is that?
I think that author has no idea what website code and marketing technology looks like.
I was afraid you were going to say that. I was totally afraid you were going to say that.
It's a mess. People have been working on some of this technology for 10 years, and it's like spaghetti monster all over the place. They can't just peel one piece out of it and turn it off without the whole thing kind of failing. So if you think of it kind of like Jenga, if you pull out one piece, you could be okay, or the whole tower could come down. And for a company that makes its entire living on that tower, they're not going to risk bringing that tower down until they really understand how to turn things off or how to do things properly. I think that what's happened with the GDPR, for example, is that most companies have said that if I put a little thing on the bottom of my website that says, I use cookies, you have to agree if you want to go any further, click here. That's their entire answer to GDPR.
Forced consent. Forced consent. If you want to come to my site, you got to agree to all my egregious data collection policies. And if you don't want to be agreeing to this, you just don't have to use my site. And this forced consent idea has always been problematic for a lot of the privacy rights groups in the European Union. So, not really sure where to go with that, but.
Well, I would add that, and I say the same thing every time that this topic comes up, which is, we made our bed, now we got to sleep in it, and the only advice I would give a corporation is going back to the concept of flip the funnel, which is build a list of customers and advocates and influencers. And if ever the whole idea of an owned asset was more relevant and more valuable, this would be that reason, rather than have to wade through this muck, and it's just like a minefield right now going into this new era. I mean, this is the life, and this is the world that we created, and now we got to live in it. And the best way to get around that, not around it, the best way to kind of, future-proof ourselves, if you will, is to focus on our own house, our own customers, and make it the best possible experience, and build that direct relationship with them.
Well, moving on to our last topic because we are running out of time. Crowdfunding apparently is back. Now, I found this article to be a little bit disingenuous, but I'm going to take it seriously for a moment and say maybe crowdsourcing is coming back. However, I'm going to caveat this by giving an anecdote. I was just at the Toy Fair, the New York Toy Fair that happens every year, a big event that showcases a lot of the inventions of new toys every single year. And I always walk around and I ask people how they go about launching their new products, especially young and small companies that are doing it in an entrepreneurial fashion. And a couple of years ago, everybody talked about Kickstarter and how much they were using Kickstarter to start things off. This year, I walked around and almost nobody was using a crowdfunding website in terms of trying to launch their product. They were using other types of funding sources, including lending, which seem to be a little bit more popular right now with entrepreneurs. So my question is that what you're seeing in the marketplace in general, Joe, or is this something that is just unique to the toy industry and actually Kickstarter and Indiegogo and all these other sites are on an upswing?
I mean, I feel like my answer is going to be kind of esoteric, which is I didn't know I didn't know crowdfunding had ever arrived, and I also didn't know that it ever went away. I still think there is no question that for everything from micro investing and microfinancing to crowdfunding, this clearly is an idea whose time has come, or maybe it's an idea whose time has not come yet, but it is coming. And I think the ability for us to perfect and fine tune that, that quid pro you know what I mean. Cat's got my tongue tonight, but that value exchange is going to be vital. And I think certainly the Kickstarters of the world have had some challenges in terms of managing timelines, in terms of the reward structure. I ran a Kickstarter campaign myself with my previous book, and I didn't like the fact that I didn't like some of the terms and conditions, and I didn't feel that value exchange was where it needed to be. So I think that we may see a 2.0 and a 3.0, but certainly if you take your toy marketplace, Bob, I mean, how it must be damn near impossible to successfully launch a product if you're an entrepreneur or a sole proprietor. I have to believe that technology, I have to believe social media, I have to believe that ultimately some kind of crowdfunding product is gonna help. And maybe the only thing that's missing is just that kind of crowdfunding platform that is industry or vertically specific, to help drive and draw better attention and visibility, to make sure that the cream rises to the top.
So one of the things that I've been seeing a lot of is, and this has happened to me now twice, for my cell phone, I bought an extra battery charger that was also a case. I didn't buy a Mophie. I wanted to buy something different. And I didn't realize this, but it was actually not available for sale yet because they were collecting a lot of orders before they went and made their product. So it took quite a long time for me to get what I was, ordered. And I had the same thing happen with a brand new shoe manufacturer. They took a lot of orders, and then 3 months later, I got my shoes. And so I think one of the things that's happening is that people are using pre-orders to fund their startups. And they're really trying to prove whether or not, and you see this if you look in your Facebook feed or in other social media, where you're looking at something that you think looks like it might be great, but then you look at it, it says, taking pre-orders now, and they're billing your credit card right now. So I think maybe that might be part of the reason why the Kickstarter thing is a little bit less prevalent. I don't know if that's crowdsourcing, but it's kind of crowdsourcing in a way that you don't realize you're sourcing some other company.
And what I would add is that it's like a standing joke in my house that every single time a box arrives with Chinese writing on it, my family roll their eyes and they go, they're like, Dad, have you been on Instagram again?
Yep.
I can't help myself. I just, at least once a day, I'm buying absolute crap from Instagram. So I think that there are other ways to be able to now, through very, very targeted and direct mechanisms to get your product out there. And of course, I haven't seen toys, but I've seen almost everything else, and just hopefully my privacy has been protected and no one can see what I'm buying, because I'll get into trouble. I'm just kidding about that. But I just think that I think the combination of almost kind of rethinking what this wisdom of crowds meets funding or investing can bring to the table, combined with some of these platforms like Instagram, represents a great way for entrepreneurs to continue to get to market and break through the clutter, because the clutter is just getting worse and worse.
Well, with that, it's time for the Ad Fail 5. But before we get to that segment of the show, I do want to take this quick opportunity to thank my guests again and allow them to each do a shameless plug, starting with Tamara Gaffney. You can find her at quantentmarketing.com. The link will be in the show notes. Tell us what's going on in your world, Tamara. What would you like to promote?
Okay, well, what I've decided to go off and do is to take my skills in data analysis, which are paired with what I like to call myself as a gypsy fortune teller, and to use that to help companies really get better insights and really tell stories with the data that they have, or to go help them find that data that they need for the stories that they want to tell. They could be internal, for example, strategic value propositions, and you really need to look at the data and say which direction should it go. But most likely it's for external use. And a lot of companies nowadays will invest in finding out things so that they can tell their consumers about it, and then in exchange get some media attention, either via a podcast, for example, or maybe it's in an article. And so content marketing is a term that I came up with to really describe that it's content, but it's with a special twist, which is that it has data analysis with it.
Yeah, and for everybody out there, if you have a chance to actually meet, talk to, or work with Tamara, you will not be disappointed. I mean, the time when we first met and we had that conversation, Tamara, it was just a bright spot in a otherwise, endless stream of content conference. It just kind of stood out. You're really kind of an interesting person, and I really want to make sure that everybody actually takes you seriously and goes to your website and checks you out. So thank you so much for participating tonight. Next up, we have Joe Jaffe. You can find him at thehmsbeagle.com. That is the home of his consultancy that he founded with Lynn Power. Tell us what's going on in your world, Joe. What would you like to promote?
First of all, you've never spoken about me as glowingly as you just did about Tamara. So that must mean that she is as special as you say she is, and
it
I'm
was
not.
7 years
Oh
ago.
my gosh, you guys, I'm blushing now.
It was 7 years ago you first came on the show. You forget how much I gushed over you.
Screw you, Norb. Screw you. No. So we are, I guess, about 2 weeks away from South by Southwest, and certainly if you are going to South by Southwest, no brainer. Let's connect. Let's meet at the Driscoll Hotel between the hours of 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. And I have a few openings. But really, the thing that I feel that I'm in a good position to start talking about now is finally to talk about my new book. So for those of you that don't know, or I haven't mentioned the name of the book is Built to Suck: The Inevitable Demise of the Corporation and How to Save It with a question mark, because I'm not sure that the corporation can be saved. And if you want to find out more, you can go to builttosuck.com. But more importantly, BeanCasters, we've been doing this for 7 years now. I don't ask a lot of you, but I am going to ask you to go to Amazon, look up Built to Suck, and pre-order a copy. Do it for me, do it for the kids, do it for my dog. But seriously, I'm so proud of this book, and I do think it's the best book I've written to date, and hopefully you will agree with me. So that's my plug.
Yeah, definitely. Joe has a lot of books out there, and if you have not read one of his books, you definitely should check them out. As for me, for more information about me or the show, visit thebeancast.com. There you can find a complete show archive. You can find out how to consult with me, and you can even find out how to advertise on the program. So check it all out at thebeancast.com. And now it's time for the Ad Fail 5, a rundown of the lowest moments in advertising, marketing, and public relations from the last week. First up, Jussie Smollett's, the Empire actor, had a little PR blunder. He tried to do a PR building stunt where he got attacked by people who were shouting, wearing MAGA hats and shouting out all kinds of racial disparaging comments and homophobic comments, and he actually had people beat him up, and it turns out the whole thing was staged. I'm not really sure where to go with this one, Tamara. I mean, it's just like he really betrayed a lot of people with this action. And it's like, how could you think this was a good PR move in order to get a raise on your show?
You know what? I just watch Instagram, and I think people have become so enamored of being famous or having that moment that they're really willing to put themselves out in a way that I don't really think they meant to, or they really wouldn't have if they thought about it more. So I wonder sometimes if social media will ultimately stop because of all this types of stuff and this behavior. That I've just seen so many people get trapped in this desire for publicity.
I totally agree with you. It's just like the social media hamster wheel is just going full tilt right now. So next up, Google's secret mic and Nest devices. Apparently Google had a microphone in their Nest devices, and it only got revealed to consumers when they said, hey, we're going to add Google Home into your device. And people said, how are you going to do that, Joe? And it's like, they said, well, we've got a mic in there. And suddenly people were really freaked out about this mic that was never turned on. Now, Google says they never tried to hide it, but this is just such an embarrassment for them, and yet another example of how out of touch they can be with consumers.
I mean, it's so funny. You've seen like more and more the people that I come into contact with have got like masking tape on their cameras, on their laptops. And you're probably going to go into the smart home that's going to be more like the eyes wide shut home, because you're going to have masking tape on your kettle, on your toaster, on your fridge, on your Nest, in your toilet. It's kind of like, did we really think that there weren't microphones and cameras in all of these smart IoT-enabled devices? And now, the backlash is going to be filled with a lot of masking tape. That's all I'm saying.
Good point. Next up, Wall Street Journal finds lots of apps reporting back to Facebook. Apparently, Facebook has been getting all kinds of data from our mobile apps, including menstruation data, pregnancy data, name, address, school, all this information that's being collected by these apps and then transmitted back to Facebook because of the Facebook login. For me, when I'm looking at this tomorrow, all I can think is, maybe I should really rethink using the Facebook login. That's the real problem here, right?
Yeah, that is where it comes from. And when you do that login, it does say to you, we're going to collect this, and that. And you just press OK. And I think what's happened is that people have just been hitting the OK button because they want to get to whatever they're trying to log into. I do think that with fingerprint-enabled logins, we don't need the Facebook ID anymore. And I think that will probably become a thing of the past.
Now, next up, BMF, an agency, a co-owner of this agency, sues their agency for allegedly demoting her after learning she was pregnant. Joe, you've run an agency. You've been in the position where you've had to deal with employees. It seems like a no-brainer that if you've given someone a promotion, you don't take it back from them after you find out that she's pregnant. Whether or not that's the reason or not, which it clearly was in this particular case, but whether it's the reason or not, it just seems like a bonehead move that you would never make, right?
Well, I'll tell you, I hope she's learned her lesson, and I hope I'm pretty sure she'll never do that again.
Oh, man.
No, it's ridiculous. dumb people. Bob Garfield once said, the agency business is filled with smart people making dumb decisions. And sometimes dumb people make even dumber decisions.
Yeah, agreed with that. And last but not least, for both of you, fallout for Nike over Zion Williamson's shoe blowout and subsequent injury. How bad can it get for a company where your shoe is on one of the hottest stars in college basketball, and the shoe blows out and you injure the player in the process, and it's all covered nationally on television? How does Nike come back from this, Tamara? I mean, what do they do?
I'm a little bit surprised that the immediate reaction was to go and blame Nike. I mean, I've watched NASCAR and those tires go bad all the time, and they say Goodyear on the side. If you're an athlete and you're pushing your equipment to the max, it blows up sometimes. And it's never been that, gosh, when a car crashed in a NASCAR race or an Indy 500 or something like that you went and blamed the tire manufacturer and no one would buy those tires anymore. So I'm just a little surprised at how reactionary consumers and the press are against brands, and I think maybe it's a backlash against brands.
But this is Nike. It's got to be the shoes. Remember?
Well, it was actually. I know a little bit about this topic because I was actually commenting on it last week. It didn't help that this game was televised, nationally televised, and it didn't help that Zion is literally the hottest, rising star at the collegial level, and it didn't help that former President Barack Obama was sitting courtside, and they caught him mouthing, his shoe broke. So you take all of this together, and look, sometimes bad luck happens to good brands, and sometimes, in this particular case, Nike has been opportunistic in a good way. Remember when Tiger Woods had that incredible putt in the Masters, and the ball stopped right on the hole, and that Nike swoosh was showing, and then it just whirled it in, and the ball fell in. This is one of those. This is the opposite, and ultimately, it's important for Nike to respond. This is crisis communication central, right? So how Nike responds is critical. Because it's an ad fail, and we like puns, I would just say they may get away with it this time, but if they slip up again, you know that their stock price. I'll give you a few stats because again, I researched this topic. First of all, Nike controls 90% of the basketball market when within its category. Basketball contributes 14% of its total revenue, and the day after this happened, their stock price was down by as much as 1.7%. I think it ended the day down 1%. Can you imagine what happens if this happens again? So let's assume, tomorrow you're absolutely right, and it was just it happens, right? You can't have a zero defect production line. But can you imagine it happens again to another high-profile athlete? You could see the company never recovering, at least in basketball. So they've been cautious. They are, I guess, getting to the bottom of it. But it's one of those things where now the kind of genie's out the bottle when it comes to the fact that this brand may not be completely perfect. And so it's going to be very interesting to see what happens.
Well, have something to add to this list or just want to discuss it? Comment online, use the hashtag AdFail5, that's pound, AdFail, and the number 5. And that does it for this week's show. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, visit our website at thebeancast.com and click on the subscribe link. If you're an Apple Podcast listener, we've also provided a direct link to our listing there, or just search for the BeanCast in the podcast directory on the Apple Podcasts app. And whichever podcast directory you use, when you subscribe, please leave us a review. Got a comment? Have a question? We'd love to hear from you. Just send your emails to beancast@gmail.com. Opening theme was performed by Joe Seibel. Closing theme by C. Jax. Thanks for listening. I'm Bob Norp. We'll be back again next week. Hope you'll join us then.
It's like, you know what I mean? It's like if it's, you know what I mean? I don't know, man. Just like, okay, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like totally like that. It's like, I don't know, like if it's, you know, it's like, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's just like kind of, it just seems like it's just like almost exactly. It's like exactly. Yeah. You know what I mean? Exactly.
Cool beans.